Welcome. Gary Hornby here from Barbados. I'm going to share with you my presentation, which is on evaluating inclusive education options for facilitating lifelong inclusion. And the presentation here is all free for you online in a journal article, open access journal article in the journal Education Sciences. So you just need to put these details into Google, Education Sciences, and you'll have it. Now, the article focuses on 3 areas. And because of a limited time, I can only go over 1 here. But the first area that's covered in the article is research on the views of teachers, parents, and young people with special needs and disabilities themselves on inclusive education versus special education interventions. And the second aspect of the article is research evidence on academic and social progress at school resulting from inclusive and special education interventions. So they're in the article, but here, as is the third part, which I'm going to go through here, which is evidence from evaluations of long-term outcomes of 3 different options for young people with either intellectual disabilities or severe emotional behavioral difficulties in facilitating inclusion. So there's 3 different options we're going to look at. First is a case study of special class in New Zealand that I taught during the 1970s of young people aged 14 to 16 years in special class for children with moderate learning difficulties based in a mainstream secondary school. We didn't follow the national curriculum. We used a social and vocational training curriculum. Pupils spending 1 day a week in work experience jobs, organized and supervised by the class teacher. So the focus of work in the classroom was on functional academics, daily living skills, social skills, and vocational skills. So the curriculum was designed to teach the skills needed for successful inclusion in the community post-school. So we did lots of role play of challenging situations, class discussion, problem solving, we had lots on handling money, learning to get information by reading newspapers, filling in forms, learning travel skills, how to use buses, etc. We did work simulations, for example, packing biscuits in the classroom using a production line. And then the money we made from that, the kids made lists of what they needed to cook a simple meal for lunch. And then in groups of 3, they would go out 3 at a time to the local shop and buy the ingredients and come back and cook the lunch under my supervision. So we did a whole range of things, not the academic. The academics were the least thing we did. Okay, so outcomes. Over the 3 years I was there, 30 young people who left, 28 of them got jobs in open employment, and only 2 went on to shelter workshops because they couldn't hold down jobs in open employment. So many of them were employed in the jobs they worked in for their 1 day a week work experience. So employers would see what they were like, and then would, if it was working out, would keep them on after school, which is great. So I was able to do some informal feedback, informal follow-up until 3 years after I left the school, and found that they typically kept the jobs or got new ones. So that was actually a very good outcome for the majority of kids. So the anecdotal findings supported the view that a vocational curriculum, including work experience in the last 2 years of school for young people with moderate learning difficulties, helped them to get employed and have a good quality of life. And this is backed up by international research on that view. So the second study was one done in the north of England, and it was conducted with a special school principal who'd been employed to close down a special school for children with moderate learning difficulties by including them in mainstream schools for the last few years of their school lives. So 29 young people were transferred from the special school for moderate learning difficulties to mainstream schools with support in terms of teacher aides, etc., organized by the principal. All the kids were, and their parents were interviewed several years later. While they were still at school, they were interviewed to see how they were getting on and what the views were of the transfer. But we then followed up when they were an average age of 22 years with another set of interviews to look at how they got on after they left school. And we found that out of the 29, 24 we managed to locate, and an average of 7 years at the special school, and then spent an average of about 3 years in the mainstream schools at the end of their school lives. All the young people had followed mainly academic curriculum in mainstream schools, not the vocational curriculum and work experience they would have had they stayed in the special school. 11 out of 12 of them who were in special education classes in schools saw the transfer positively, as did their parents, compared with only 4 out of 12 in the mainstream classes. So the outcomes at age 22 years, 17 out of 24 were unemployed. Only 3 were working full time. So just to repeat that, the vast majority of them were unemployed. 8 out of 9 who had held jobs at some stage had work experience at school or further education college, compared with 4 out of 15 who had not had work experience. So obviously work experience had been helpful. 17 out of the 24 were living with their parents. Only 4 were living independently. 16 of the 24 were on severe disability allowance, which meant that they were deemed unable to be employed. And that then put them in a category where they were on track to be unemployed for the rest of their lives at the age of 22, which the ex-principal who I worked with on this study was shocked and upset by this finding. He considered that most of them should have been able to find jobs had they had the right help, but the reality was they hadn't been able to find jobs. So the outcomes were very poor and were alarming to the ex-principal, and it was in contrast to the findings that I had from the special class kids that with me a few years earlier. Right, the third study was a follow-up of young people that had been at a residential school for children with emotional and behavioral difficulties in their primary school years. And we tracked them down. There were 51 that had attended the school between 89 and 92. And we tracked down 29 of them. And they were interviewed, would be 10 to 14 years after they'd left school. So criteria for entry to the school was at least an average IQ with emotional behavioral difficulties that could not be coped with within a mainstream school. So they were at the school between 10 and 30 months, an average of 18 months, because government policy was to have them to have just a maximum of 24 months at the school and then transfer back to mainstream schools for the rest of their schooling. So on the transfer back, they had transition plans and visits from special school staff for the first year. But the feedback on this from the special school staff was that the implementation was poor. And when interviewed, they were aged an average of 24 years of age. So outcomes. 27 out of the 29 left school with no qualifications whatsoever. Only 2 left school with qualifications. And considering they all had at least average IQs, that's quite a shocking finding. 17 out of 29 left school before the legal age for leaving, which was 16 years. They'd either dropped out or been asked to leave or stopped attending. 9 out of the 29 were working full-time and 6 out of 20 part-time. So about half of them had jobs, half didn't. 4 out of the 29 were in jail. We interviewed them in jail. And 19 out of the 29 reported they had they admitted to having criminal records. 11 of the 29 were in de facto marital relationships, but none of them were actually married. So they were overwhelmingly negative about their experiences at the mainstream schools that they transferred to after being in the residential school. They complained about bullying from other children, and also about the labeling and lack of understanding they experienced from the mainstream school teachers. Whereas they were overwhelmingly positive about their experiences at the special school. They felt they'd been helped with their learning difficulties, helped to achieve more academically, and helped to manage their behavior better. So my conclusion from the 3 studies is that the positive outcomes for the teenagers with moderate learning difficulties taught in the secondary school special class in New Zealand were in stark contrast to the poor outcomes from the follow-up research of young people with moderate learning difficulties in the UK, included in mainstream schools for the final years of their schooling. Findings suggest that a special class in a mainstream school was more effective than inclusion in mainstream secondary classes in ensuring ex-students got jobs and had a decent quality of life. The poor educational attainments, but positive views of the most young people with emotional behavioral difficulties about their time at the special school, contrasted with the negative views of all of them about their time in mainstream schools, suggesting that transferring them back to mainstream schools to finish their schooling was counterproductive. It just didn't work. It all fell apart. And all the gains they'd made while they were in the special school were lost. So the overall conclusion from this brief review of these 3 studies is that effective specialized instruction, vocational curricula, and work experience are of greater importance for enabling inclusion in the community post-school for young people with special needs and disabilities than being included in mainstream secondary schools towards the end of their time at school. These findings are supported by international research reporting disappointing outcomes for children with special needs and disabilities who have been in inclusive settings at the secondary school level. Therefore, rather than full inclusion, my belief is that inclusive special education is the best way forward, as it ensures young people are educated in the settings that best meet their needs, whether special or mainstream. Such decisions must be made on research evidence of effectiveness. This is my main conclusion. And so the references here are here, and there we are. So hopefully that's useful and interesting, and now open to any questions that you may like to pose about this. Thank you very much. Let's turn off the video.